can tell this is a cheap college video. Okay, you ready?
I'm ready. Let's go.
Okay, hi everyone. This is Anna Seeloff, and today I'm with Luke Moore in Urbana-Champaign at the University of Illinois. So, Luke, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, and thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you coming. Like, how long of a drive was it for you?
About 4 hours. Not bad.
And where do you live again?
Paducah, Kentucky.
Okay, came from Kentucky. Well, today we're going to talk about the Trace and some of Luke's work with the Edwards Trace. So, but I guess first thing I want to ask you, when and where were you born?
Springfield, Illinois, in 1957, and raised in Springfield. And in 1990, a job in the marine business took me and my family to Paducah, Kentucky. And about 10, 15 years later, the job was over, but we liked Kentucky and we decided to stay. So, But we still visit Springfield, and family and friends in Springfield often. But our regular residence is now in Kentucky, and we like it down there.
Do you have any children?
No, we don't. Just my wife and I and a pup. So,
Okay.
Yeah.
So what do you currently do now for work?
I'm a captain of a Mississippi River towboat.
Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So what does
have
that
been
entail?
since 1977.
Okay. What does that entail?
Well, I go out on the river once a month. I go out for a month-long trip, and I stay on the boat for 30 days, and we travel from St. Paul, Minnesota, down to New Orleans, maybe up the Ohio to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So I'll do my 30 days, and then my relief will show up to do his 30 days, and then I go home for a month. So it breaks down to 6 months a year I'm on the river, and 6 months a year I'm home with my wife and I. So,
Well, I remember talking to you last time. You're getting close to retirement.
I am.
Okay.
Yep, I am. I haven't decided yet, but it'll probably be any minute now. So I just don't know yet. I'm kind of right on the fence. We're ready for it. I just don't know when to finally call it quits for that career and start another, but we're still looking at all that. But anytime now, I'm sure this will be my last year on the river.
So probably, are you going to stay in Kentucky or?
We are,
Okay.
yes, we are. Yeah, that's home. That is home. But in my new career, I guess you could say, is going to be historical research, and that'll take us all over the country. And Paducah is centrally located to the places I would like to study and to research. So it's a great place to live, and it's a great place to work out of. So we're looking forward to it.
Well, we're going to talk about history then. So I'm kind of curious, so like, how did you become interested in learning about history?
Well, it's natural, working on the river, there's names of these old river towns or bends or certain landmarks along the river. And it's a natural curiosity, I wonder how this got this name and who is this named after. And so it just kind of starts that way, and then it just kind of leads on. I became interested in pathways, early pathways, which the river was. The French discovered that as soon as they came to the North American continent, that the waterways connects everyone in the North American continent, the central part of the North America. And it's from that I just became interested in the pathways, and that led to the Edwards Trace eventually. And then the more we learned about that, the more we wanted to learn, and I met people along the way, and gosh, 11 years later, here we are, and we feel like we're just scratching the surface on that old pathway. So, so I've kind of less on the waterway pathways, even though it was an intermodal type. The French had waterway connections to roadway connections and pathways to communities, and both French, Spanish, British, Native American, and they were all kind of in a partnership in the fur trade, and lead, of course, came later. So with the river came the paths, and with the paths came the paths of the river, the courses. So it all just dovetailed together, and so one naturally went into the other. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that, especially since you're always on the Mississippi River.
Yeah.
So you're kind of following your passion a bit.
Yeah, well, sure. I mean, it's fascinating. When I go to the boat this time, right now they're at Cairo, Illinois, and they're going to turn, and they're on their way to Minnesota, I hear. So I'll join the crew when they get around St. Louis next week, and then I'll take it on up to St. Paul, Minnesota, and along the way, we'll see places, Old Fort Armstrong, Old Fort Madison, those sites. And through historical reconstruction, those forts have been rebuilt. And so, yeah, it's kind of neat to see these places that you read about, in the history books. So,
yeah. I think going to see those places, it's so much better than I think just reading a book.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, absolutely. It's like a 3D presentation of one-dimensional words on a page. Mm-hmm. So certainly it fills that out. To see it is very important. So I think it gives me a unique perspective from being in the middle of the river looking outward versus being on the outside looking in. So,
right.
Yeah.
Well, with the Edwards Trace, so like what we've talked about, especially this summer,
yeah.
It's a 3,000-year-old Native American trail that started in Kaskaskia.
Yeah.
And went all the way up to Peoria, but also up to Galena, correct?
Well, it was a connecting link.
trail.
If you took the segment of the Edwards Trace, it went to Cairo Point, crossed the Ohio, down through Tennessee, through Mississippi, all the way to the Gulf of Mexico, and then northward it went to Peoria, then on up to Prairie du Chien, and then all the way up to Minnesota. And then, like the arteries of the human body, all of these secondary paths joined with it. So it was just a small piece of the entire overland system. Edwards traveled one short segment of it in October of 1812, and it just got the name, the Edwards Trace, because of his march during October of 1812. But it's also been called the Galena Road. It's been called the Fort Clark Road. So it had a far-reaching from Kaskaskia to Peoria, then above, beyond north, and beyond south. So, yeah.
Well, and we'll talk about like those connecting trails here in a bit, but we talked about earlier with how you just loved reading, and it's so much nicer just to see these places.
Yes.
I don't think too many people know this, but with the Edwards Trace, though, there's really no information out there, like barely, it seems like.
Not a lot. You know what, as far as from the scientific investigations, Bob Mazerin did a lot of work about the Edwards Trace through his archaeological projects with down at Fort Sharts, Cahokia, places like that. And so he had been mapping the road. David Brady in Springfield in 1992 discovered a remnant of the trace at Lake Park at Lake Springfield on that dividing ridge. So there's been these small segments, but no one's ever really sat down and looked at it in its totality from Peoria all the way to Edwardsville. And so our project has been trying to find it with physical proof that it's there, either photographs or electromagnetivity or subsurface explorations. We are trying to find proof positive that here it is, and this is why we think this is the trace. We use historical maps, which we've been lucky to find through different venues like the National Archive in Washington. There are several maps that survive from 1815, 1816, 1819, and we were able to use that as a reference, and using those references put us in a spot very close, and then we looked for soil anomalies, and by gosh, we were surprised at how many ruts of that old wagon trail is still lying there. They've just been overlooked because nobody thought, well, this is a historic trail.
Right.
And so with all these things as a way to give us X marks the spot, we're able to find, I think, about 3 miles of physical proof linked together of that old trail that by all purposes disappeared by the 1840s, 1850s. So it's still, the wagons really scarred the landscape, deep ruts in certain areas, and we were able to uncover that quite a bit, mostly through like LiDAR imaging. So,
well, those wagons would have had to been really narrow, right?
4 foot. The Kentucky wagon. You know, most everyone come from the South when they came into Illinois, and so the average wagon was about 48 inches wide, and the wheels were very narrow. And the wheels with a steel band around it called a tire were only about 1.5 inches wide. And when you're loaded down to 1/2 ton of stuff, everything they own on those wagons, it would cut, especially into the the soft topsoil after a rain and would make ruts and mud holes is what it was. I mean, for the traveler back in the day, mud was a everyday, every mile event. So
Yeah.
mud, and more mud. But the wagons tore up that topsoil. They didn't spread the load out evenly. It was just almost narrow wheels, and it cut into it. So
Have you been able to find like pieces of the trail that where you can see that with
Oh,
the
yeah.
wheels? Yeah.
oh yeah. Well, deep ruts.
Deep ruts.
Deep ruts. I mean, no wagon would follow the other exactly. Like when we see at Honey Point, LiDAR imaging shows at least 6 distinct tracks that were deeply cut into the soil. So you're heading to Peoria with a wagon load of grain for the Fort Clark there in 1812. You're going to go up this hill, but it's full of mud. So you're going to guide the oxen around that. So now you're going to make another rut going around that rut. And so that's why we see these braided channels going down grades or going up grades, especially when there's a water crossing. The reason they avoided the open prairie and the flat levelness is because there's no water, there was no wood for fires, and they were left exposed out into the open to the elements.
So it's basically swampy.
Yes,
At that time.
there were sippy holes out in the dry prairie. There were places where seep water would come up from, the prairie was a 20-foot deep sponge, if you will. Grass grows, it dies, it compacts, grass grows. And so after a millennia of this, it gets deeper and deeper and deeper of this black mulch that's ideal for planting corn, but it was murder to get a heavily laden wagon across without sinking into it. But they would also hold water, and the water would accumulate at the very bottom where it met the clay surface and start to build up like an underground lake, and then seep out the first escape that it could find, springs. And so wherever there's a spring, you're going to find these wagon ruts where the travelers knew this is where we can get fresh water for not just us, but also for our animals.
Well, I know that there's a Buffalo Pond. Are you familiar with that?
I know of that pond by Gillespie, I think someone said. The early plats, you can go online and look at State of Illinois Historic Plats, and it was the first GLOs, the General Land Office drawings. There was a big rush. Edwardsville opened their land office in 1819, and there was a rush to sell land. As soon as they could survey it, they would put it up for sale because people were ahead of them. People were already moving in. Well, we're not going to wait around for Uncle Sam. We're going to go up to Central Illinois, and we're going to stake out our own places.
Oh, yeah.
And so the government was trying to keep up because they needed that income. The United States was broke. They were poor on cash, but they had land. And as fast as they could get a treaty signed, they would survey the land and they would put a pathway through it. The Edwards Trace gave them this egress into Central Illinois up towards Peoria.
Right.
So,
Well, and I think the big thing I've been trying to tell people too with this trail, it basically helped form these towns like
absolutely.
Springfield, Lincoln.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, it helped people migrate up north.
Bob Mazerum talked about that quite a bit in one of his books, and I think it's not quite out of archaeology, but it's the story of Frontier, Illinois. And forgive me if that's the wrong book. I think he has 2 where he talks about the Edwards Trace, but he shows in a chapter of how land lots were sold. They were surveyed and then sold, and you can see people just kind of going up the Illinois River, of course, land sales up the Illinois, but also in the center of the prairie through following that Edwards Trace. So it was an open highway to say, come on up, we're open for business, buy some land. And then I think by 1824, they opened up a land office further north of Springfield, and then further on up, and then further on up. So finally, when they got to Wisconsin, but you can see the settlement of Illinois from the south moving northward. But the Edwards Trace was an artery where the early, everybody wanted to land right on the road. And just like when they finally put railroads in, everybody wanted their towns and property on the railroad, thinking, well, this is how I can ship my corn. This is how we can get stuff back in. People will come in on passenger trains. So But in the earliest of days, it was trails like the Edwards Trace that people wanted to be on that main road, the main highway. So,
Yeah.
mhm.
Well, I want to talk about the connecting trails. So when I've told you about me traveling with my family,
Right, yes,
but that was about 11 years ago now.
right, sure.
But back it was in 2011 when this organization started the Kaskaskia Trail.
Mhm.
I can't think of the name right now, but there's an organization.
Sure.
But when I took that trail, there was no markers or anything
Right.
back then. But then when I took the trip this last summer,
Mm-hmm.
there are markers now.
Great.
So, but
Good.
I wasn't for sure if you're familiar with that organization.
No, I've never looked south of Edwardsville. We followed where Governor Edwards marched the 350 soldiers, the militia, up the trace. And so we kept our study between Fort Russell, the location of Fort Russell, which is just north of Edwardsville, to Peoria. And all of our 11 years has been looking at Edwardsville to Springfield, which isn't that far. But when you get on the ground and start walking around and kicking the brush, 11 years went like that. I mean, we thought, where did the time go? We haven't really spent much time north of Springfield for two reasons. Maps were harder to come by, so we didn't have a lot of hard data to fall back on. Most of the documentation that we discovered was from Springfield to Edwardsville, but it's going to take another 11 years just to get from Springfield to Peoria. We've got a few glimpses, a few clues of where the trace crossed the especially between Lincoln and Peoria. That is a big kind of a gap, and we're kind of right. We have a couple of places that where the road was included in land surveys where they crossed township sections, but very, very little. I mean, big gaps. So you just have to guess. And when they sold the land plats, they were sold in geometric grids. I mean, it's 1 mile by 1 mile, and townships were 6 miles by 6 miles, and then that was broken up 36 times, one by one, and then that was broken up, and then that was broken up, and then they were sold as 140-acre plots. Well, it was geometric with no outside of a riverway, no natural boundary. So the wandering trace got lost in that grid, that geometric grid, and that's when we see the trace kind of disappear. As soon as those lots were sold, nobody wanted the road to go cattywampus. They straightened it up, so it was quickly plowed under.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I know in Logan County there are definitely plenty of areas where you can actually see the trace.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
At Lincoln Memorial Park in Lincoln.
Yes.
My father actually found that portion.
Yes.
So you can actually still see it. Do you know much about trail trees at all?
I do not.
Okay.
We did not, and I've read your report about that. I think I saw your Facebook page where you talked about that tree that's got that bend in it.
Oh, I'm glad you watch it. Okay.
Yeah, so I saw that. But no, I didn't even know that was there. I heard a rumor that there was a trail tree at the Memorial Park area, but we never did see it while we were there. We were looking at that rut, and we determined that you and your dad were right, that looked like a wagon rut coursing up. Whenever it goes up a hill, you have to look for how do you get a 500 or 800 pound loaded wagon pulled by oxen up a steep grade. Well, it doesn't go straight up. It's got to find a circuitous route to take some of that angle off so the animals can get it up there. And right there where you guys thought you saw the trail is right the spot that we saw too. And now LiDAR pretty much supports that. And I recently saw a 1900s vintage topographical map that shows those roads coming up there and coming right out there. Yeah. And I don't know if they called it the Chautauqua or if they called it a club grounds or something, but I know it's where the Chautauqua used to be.
Yeah, I think you're right. Chautauqua. Yeah.
But it shows it coming up out of the river bottoms and curling up and through that ravine and coming up right where your video showed it to come up, and then that rut makes that turn northward, just like we knew it. Wagons would have had to turn northward. And it also ties in, that location you discovered, also ties in with John Edwards in his biography mentions seeing the Kickapoo village to the west.
Mm-hmm.
He said, we got up on the higher ground, and then we saw the Kickapoo village to our west, and so they attacked it. And when you come out of Memorial Park today and go due northward, the road site is on the west side. So it all comes together. That works in that historical remnant. So I would say that we're spot on there. I think you're right. Memorial Park.
Well, I mean, even just with all this research I've done over the years, especially my father, you know, he's also a big history buff.
Yeah.
But it's just amazing, though, just how all our lives, you know, especially me coming from Lincoln, how,
Right.
like, my life, too, like, we're all connected to this trail.
Right.
Because, like I keep saying within my projects, it was basically the Route 66 of
Yes,
its time.
absolutely. Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But just how it's influenced our towns, though.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and you know, one thing that the route followed the best available ground for migrating animals. I mean, the trail, everyone agrees, was a migratory route. And then the Paleo Indians, 12,000, 14,000 years ago, followed their food source, you know, slow-moving herds of herbivores, whether that would be elk or buffalo or deer, whatever they were following would follow their known routes in the spring to go up to get the spring grass, and in the fall, late fall, to go back down to keep finding open ground cover from the snows that were coming. Mm-hmm. The Native Americans followed that pathway. They knew this route well. On the east side of Springfield, in a nucleated pattern, we see some 50 burial mounds all around where the trace crossed the Sangamon River, not 5 miles west or not 5 miles east, but right there. And the question would be, did the pathway of these migrating animals influence the archaic, the paleo, the archaic, the early woodland Native Americans that settled in central Illinois? And so it looks like it.
Yeah.
You know, it looks like it could, but without much more scientific survey and way beyond my wheelhouse. It's just a kind of a good guess right now.
Yeah.
So, but it just, I always thought it was unique how the largest concentration of multicultural burial sites are all around that trace, where you can stand where the trace crosses the river, and within a mile on the compass all around you, you can see those 50 sites. Mm-hmm. So I think that's pretty incredible. That's kind of telling that it was important 2,000 years ago. Right. If those are woodland mounds, then that's 2,000 years ago. If it's archaic mounds, that could be 8,000 years ago. Yeah. So how long has a trace been there? How long did the Native Americans utilize this pathway? And I would think it was a very big role in the settlement, and not just Euro-American, but Native American as well. So
yeah. Well, and Springfield, we mentioned that there's a portion of it that you can see near Lake Springfield.
Yes.
And you know, and I've been there, you've been there.
Yes.
And there's a historical marker out there too. But there was questions of whether if that was man-made.
Yeah, well, sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
And I don't know if you read about that, but I first heard about this last year.
You gave your presentation.
Yeah.
And I haven't read anything about it, but you gave your presentation, which I was fortunate enough to be able to attend at the U of I in Springfield. Mm-hmm. And during the questioning period, someone asked that, have you heard that heavy equipment while they're building the lake use that? My thoughts are, yeah, everyone used it. It was the high ground between the low ground to the west, which was Sugar Creek Bottoms, and it was the high ground from the lowland on the east. It's a very narrow ridge in there, and where you see that sign, where the sign marks a remnant, is right on the apex of this ridge. So traveling animals would utilize that. Native American groups would use. I mean, why go down in the bottoms and all that briars and brush and swamp and all when it's so much easier to stay up on the ridge and travel? And so, yeah, sure, construction crews as well. I'm no doubt before they had the highway built that was one way to get from one end to the other. But I would say that those tractors and dozers and whatever they used to construct that in the 1930s,
The lake.
yeah,
Yeah.
whatever they were following that ancient trail that had always been there, because the trail wasn't decided by the first buffalo to walk it. It was the best available ground for passing through this area. So if you wanted to get from A to B, you try to draw a straight line because you don't want to walk 3 more days and you don't have to. But then nature also kind of tells you you've got to go this way to stay out of this swamp. You got to go this way to stay, where there's available water supply. And so you take the shortest way and then you put in the little wiggles in between, and it goes right through Lake Park. I mean, it makes sense that it would.
Yeah,
So,
and it does make sense.
and as far as the dozers, I'm sure they didn't want to go through that swamp either. There used to be a lake there. There was the Illinois State Museum has a beautiful stone axe that they added to their collection in the 1930s, I think. And it's a gorgeous 3/4 grooved axe, but it came out of a small lake where Lake Springfield is today. So right off the side of Lake Park, there was a pond, and it was swampy, and I think a farmer was attempting to drain it to open.
It was a buffalo pond?
No, the Buffalo Pond would have been down towards Gillespie, but there was a lot of sippy holes. What's the term? Swampy areas. When you look at a LiDAR picture of Illinois, especially central Illinois, and you zoom out far enough, you'll see these ancient drumlins, and they're like sand dunes, long, elongated ridges that keep above it keeps you above from the lower areas by at least 15 foot. In between these ridge lines were low-lying areas, and the water we talked about seeping out from underneath the old prairie would fill with water, and people were getting caught in that muck and mire, so they avoided that by getting up on these ridge lines. Our research has shown that the trace followed the tops of these ridges. When you drive it today, they're so subtle you hardly see it. But if you were in this heavily loaded wagon and you're sinking in your axle and said, boy, we should have been over there, Paul, because it's dry and it's a little bit higher. So that's where the trail ran.
Elkhart Hill.
Yep, there you go.
Elkhart Hill is higher ground, so that you can actually still see a portion of it from the Gillette.
Yes, Gillette's
farm. Yeah, Gillette's farm.
Yeah. Yeah, it's still there. You can see how the wagons scarred that ground, and then the new modern roads, a different route, because it was those geometric property lines we talked about that dictated the new roads that were built. And the old trail is still there, and it wasn't in cultivation. That's why it survives today. The Gillette family that farmed that didn't till their front yard, and that's where you see those ruts, those old wagon trails. It's right in their front yard, and they didn't till that, so they survived. Why we have these short segments at the fingers of the old waterways, like Macoupin watershed has these points that came into the prairie, and that's where we see these ruts going across, because it was never tilled. They didn't till these valleys, these ravines. They stayed out in the level ground, and that's why the ruts, they didn't get filled in. So.
Well, thinking about, Galena, so do you think in the next, say, 11 years or whatever, would you try to go up farther north maybe?
No, I don't think so. I think that Tracy, David, and I will spend the rest of our lives studying about 10 miles of the prairie outside of Buckhart. It's going to take us that long just to find records and old family cemeteries and the first settlers and things, and then you have to find, well, why did they settle here? Was it because of the road? And to find this physical proof has turned out to be a daunting challenge. LiDAR, detailed surface pictures get us part of the way there, But then we have to go into records and things and try to find where, who was the first settler? Why did they settle Buckhart? Were they on the trail? Were they not on the trail? Was it because of water supply? The war trace ran on the east side of Elkhart. But John Latham settled in 1819 and he built a tavern, an overnight stay for folks on the west side. And that was the end of the east side trail. As soon as that's the end of that, everybody left the Springfield area once people started settling there and went up on the west side of Fancy Prairie Creek Timber or Wolf Creek Timber. Modern I-55 follows that same track and it passes Elkhart on the west side where Latham's tavern was at. And so you could say that James Latham decided where I-55 was going to be built. So, because he put a tavern in 1819 on the west side of Elkhart. So when he put that there, everybody going by said, well, let's go by Latham's and, we'll get a night for the room for the night and something to eat. It was like, 10 cents, 15 cents.
Yeah.
And he made that change, that and politics influenced a lot of where the road ran. Once people started selling it, they wanted the road by them if they weren't on it already. We see a change of the road down by Thomasville, which is just south of Di Vernon in the middle. There's a big house, a big mansion down there. And it's an antique mart right off I-55. And he wanted the old road off of his property. It ran on out his back door, and he wanted it on the far side of the property to the west, and it was changed. And so we hear of stories of where the political influences also, and of course it became Route 4, and then Route 66, and Interstate 55 still follows that same course. And that mansion, he still has. They didn't go through his house, so he got what he wanted. So, but so there's that kind of thing too. That everybody, like railroads, when they put a railroad in, politics had a major role in where they ran that rail. What senator had what ground, and hey, you're going to come through this county, and so there was some of that with the Edwards Trace as well. But by the 1830s, 1840s, it was disappearing quickly, especially with the advent of rail. And once rail was set between Alton and Springfield and eventually Chicago, all bets were off. Then, the interstate was right there, and it just followed those tracks because that's where people were going to and from then. So.
Well, I want to go back to Buckhart.
Yes, Buckhart.
I remember reading about that, but I do not know where that was. Where is that exactly?
Well, Buckhart is another glacial drumlin, just like Elkhart. Elkhart's a large one. That's why everybody knows Elkhart, because it's so big. Buckhart was a grove of trees on top of a hill that could be seen for miles in the prairie. So it became a became a natural landmark when walking along the trail. So when you cross the Sangamon on the east side of Springfield near Clear Lake today, where the Sangamon met the South Fork and the Sugar Creek, it crossed in between the two mouths. And once it got up on that hill, they looked for the next grove of trees, and that was Buckhart. Buffalo, I'm sorry. I'm thinking of Buffalo Heart. They could see the grove of trees of Buffalo Heart. Now you're asking me about Buckhart. Buckhart's on the Sangamon, about 10 miles upstream from that crossing of the Sangamon, just south of Mechanicsburg, I think it's called. And it's a small community on the south side of the Sangamon. It's known for its coal mines.
Okay.
Yeah, but it wasn't on the trace.
It wasn't, okay.
Yeah, I was thinking of Buffalo Heart. Buffalo Heart was the grove of trees where the trace passed by the west side because it was a natural landmark that could be seen for a long distance. Then from that, then they could see Elkhart was the next landmark to go by, and it passed on the east side. And the reason they chose the east side of Elkhart was because of a large lake. It was called Buffalo Lake by the first settlers, and they could get water. It was a camping place. They could get water out of the lake. And then they moved on up to Memorial Park there in Lincoln.
Yeah. Well, when my dad and I were taking a trip one day, and we were trying to find that buffalo heart.
Buffalo heart, yeah.
Because you had sent me emails about it, and I remember reading about it, and I was like, "Where is this?"
Yeah, due south of Springfield's kind of southwest of Elkhart.
Yeah.
Buffalo Heart is due south.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's on Highway 54. I think Highway 54 along the railroad tracks, cut right through Buffalo Heart. And we've looked for the road that we think we may have found a few ruts on the south side of that grove where they should be, but without getting up there and ground truthing, we're not really exactly sure. So much of it's in cultivation. You know, Central Illinois is a corn belt, no doubt. All of that prairie grass made amazing growing opportunities with all that black soil, a lot of nutrients, and farmers realized, boy, they get double the yields from their acres by it being out in that black soil, and that was the end of that old trail. The trail had deeply worn ruts that travelers said they could follow easily, but once cultivation started, it was gone. Yeah. And then the county laid their county roads. When you look at a map of Illinois, it's that geometric squares everywhere, that took, and that was because of property lines. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you'll have to take me out to Buffalo Heart sometime, because now I'm trying to I need to find this place.
Right.
But so with my project, we've talked so much about how it's played such an important role in Illinois, especially Central Illinois.
Yeah.
I think right now there's been questions about the Edwards Trace because of why it's named after Ninian Edwards.
Right.
And with what happened during the War of 1812, he sent troops up north.
Yes. So,
I guess in your opinion, should people be concerned that the trace was named after him, or should... It's hard to talk about because we know it happened during the War of 1812.
Yes.
And that was against, the Americans versus the Native Americans and the British at the time. And with what he did on the trail, I mean, who knows what could have happened to Illinois? Right. So I guess, what are your opinions about that, or what's been...
History is what it is. There's good things that, we're here, the European American settlement of the North American continent, but it's not without a lot of controversy, of course. Wars, there was always conflict, always. From prior to the 1812 and after 1812, there's always conflict. Treaty settlements, my gosh, you get into a lot of sad stories when you hear about treaties are made and broken again and again and again. I was reading recently about the Proud Illini. They were, and the schools named for them, they were numerous in Illinois, and within a generation they were just eradicated, and who was left was moved westward. That's also part of that story. So, but that's our history for the warts and all, I guess. But yes, and that's just not with the Edwards Trace. All of our history go back even further to the French Indian War and prior to that. So it's just been conflict. It's just when people move at a rapid pace, there's going to be conflict, because there's going to be somebody there and they're not going to want to leave just because you want to come in, and there's your conflict. So yeah, the Edwards Trace can represent some of that, but also it's a history long before that. The Euro-American history is just recent. In the last 250 years. So it just happened in the scheme of things. There's thousands of years of this trail. It's named after Ninian Edwards because of that map drawn by Rennie Paul in 1850 that said this is Edwards Trace, and here is General Scott's Trace, and here is another trace. So he gets the credit, I guess, for the Edwards Trace name. But in the day of when Edwards marched up, they were following the, I think it was a Kaskaskia to Fort Clark Road, or Kaskaskia to Peoria Road, or even Kaskaskia to Galena. because people were out mining lead early on. Dubuque had a Spanish claim in the Iowa side of the lead mines, and everyone knew that lead was like gold back then. They relied so heavily on it, and it was easy to get it as close to the surface up there, called the driftless zone. And so this was a well-known place, but Edwards got the name after him only because he marched it, and kind of like his press,
Right.
This is named after our great governor, Ninian Edwards, that kind of thing. But
and he was a well-known politician.
yes,
back
he
then,
was.
and
yes,
he was one of the founders of the state, basically.
Yes. Yes, our first territorial governor, and I think our third state governor. I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, third state governor.
Yeah.
But well, I guess to clarify with what the campaign was.
Yeah.
So during the War of 1812,
Yes.
Fort Dearborn was attacked.
Yes.
Fort
in
Dearborn,
August. Yes.
in August, which would have been in the Chicago area.
Yes.
And the reason why Ninian Edwards sent troops up north was to basically protect the people along that trail.
Yep.
And they were nervous that the Native Americans would come down and attack.
Yeah. Well, they had been raids by Native American groups from the Peoria area were common, and they knew them. And they were visitors all the time. There was an open trade. Cahokia had been trading with the Peoria for long before Edwardsville was even thought of.
Right.
So, and using that, I'm sure, not just the Illinois River, but the Edwards Trace. So in the winter months, they would come up and down. So it was a well-worn pathway long before 1812. But there was tension building. A Shawnee leader, Tecumseh, was able to gather nations in Ohio and Indiana and Illinois to come together in a confederacy, which no one ever really thought would be possible, but he did, and to stop this advancement of the settlers across the Ohio. The British told Tecumseh that they would keep the Americans south of the Ohio. Treaties were actually written with Britain under King George that the British would never come across the Ohio to the north, but within 20 years, here they came. And so Tecumseh decided to draw that line. He tried, and he went to General Harrison, I think in 1811, to kind of, or maybe even 1810, to say, this is war, we're not going quietly in the night, we're gonna fight you. And just so you'll know that this is not gonna be, you're not gonna write us off.
Right.
And Harrison decided, well, I'll send a message, and then went up and attacked Tippecanoe to send a message that you're not going to be safe anywhere. So the Indians retaliated early on, and then when the United States decided to declare a war on England in 1812, June 1812, then it was all bets were off. And the Native American groups, many were favorable to the United States, realized that this isn't going to end up well for us. We have to go with the British. Proctor made promises, and he said, if you'll side with us, we'll make this buffer between Ohio and Canada, and you'll forever be free. And within 2 or 3 years, that was over.
Right.
And the war was very short. And in the Midwest, it was more of a Native American war than it was of British soldiers and American soldiers. It was more of a frontier battle. But they come up on the short end of that battle, and the British took off across the lakes and stayed to the north. And they made peace with the United States, but they left their allies, Tecumseh, Shawnee, and the Potawatomi, and the Kickapoo were left with nothing left, and they ended up making treaties with Edwards and with General Clark, William Clark in St. Louis, and then within a few years, they're all west of the Mississippi, and then further, and it just went on and on until the 1870s. So.
Right. So the War of 1812.
Yes.
The French and Indian War,
Yes.
and the Revolutionary War.
Yes.
So much history happened on that trail.
Yeah.
there's not several school students that know about this trace in Illinois.
No.
And I think like there's a lot of students in general that just do not know much about Illinois history.
Mhm.
Why is that, do you think?
Well, there wasn't any great battles. We seem to remember our greatest battles. I was once talking to an archaeologist, and I said, why does anybody know about these old mounds that were in Bairdstown? He goes, well, he says, as far as mounds go, they have to really be big and stately and something you just stand back and look up.
Like Cahokia.
Cahokia.
Yeah.
And Monk's Mound is the most famous mound in Illinois because it is so big. You drive down Interstate 55 and there it is. It's so obvious that what that is, and it's incredible to think that people carried baskets of dirt and built that thing. But so Edwards Trace is not a big landmark, and it's just kind of it's virtually invisible. The sections of it that we found, there's that one short section at Lake Park that is actually public property that people can access and maybe walk 30 feet or 40 feet of it.
Yeah.
But the major ruts that we found are all on personal property, and we can't, I'm sure the farmers really wouldn't want crowds of people pulling into their backyards saying, we're going to go look at your ruts down here. They're there, but I'm hoping, we're proponents of remembering the Edwards Trace. I like to think it's Illinois' largest cultural site. It's 147 miles long. It's there. We've proven that it's still there, largely intact. All the things that happened there are worth remembering. And so we hope that someday with signage that you could bike or ride. They do it with railroad beds.
Yeah.
I hope that someday we can do that and people will realize that, well, maybe we can, tourism kind of an industry, if you will. There's a lot of places off the beaten path that follow that trace, and which would be easy to mark the roads and talk about different things that happen in different places.
Yeah.
But
I would love historical markers like the Kaskaskia Trail.
Yeah, well, I know that you're going to do that.
You think?
Yeah. I know that you will.
I want to. I mean, that's the whole, and what you just said, like, that's the whole point of this project, especially this interactive map I created. It gives people a chance to, not only learn about the trace, they can learn about the towns that the trace went through and how the trace influenced these towns, and then highlight businesses.
Yeah.
But then I think more importantly, though, like, make it fun.
Yeah.
And I think there's several students, you either like history or you don't, but teachers, I think this is a great way to basically be able to create a lesson that would be fun.
Yeah.
In general, I mean, they do a great job, like, creating lesson plans and everything.
Sure.
But using, like, what I have, too, that I wish they would incorporate that.
Yeah.
Do you think, like, teachers should incorporate, say, like, Illinois teachers now, history teachers, do you think there's a way that they can incorporate the Edwards Trace within their lesson plans?
Well, sure. I mean, when you talk about the settlement of Illinois, you can't really talk about that without mentioning, and this is how they got there.
Yeah.
This is the route that they followed. These are the hardships that your ancestors, went through to get to where we are today. So, yeah, it's a story worth remembering, no doubt.
Oh yeah.
So.
Yeah. Because when I think back when I was a kid, like, I loved, like, history. I mean, I majored in it, but I loved learning about Illinois history.
Right.
And that was never talked about until I did my own research, for that history fair project when I was 13. But I mean, that was the first time.
Sure.
So.
Well, I even tried to find famous people that we know with documented proof that traveled on the road. And golly, as much as we tried, we could not find any stories of old Abe on his horseback reading his law books while he's riding the circuit road. We know he had to ride on the trail, but we can't find that antidote that says, and on this day he rode the trail. Then we could put a sign up and money would come in and developments and things, but we just couldn't tie old Abe to the trail, though we know he rode it. And then, of course, later he would have rode the rails, but But there are not, that doesn't mean that famous people didn't follow the trace. They're just not well-known famous people, I guess. Like Charlie Goodnight lived down north of Edwardsville, just south of Buckhart. He went on to found one of the largest ranches in the United States of America in Texas, and they penned a novel based on his life, Lonesome Dove. So he's born and raised right on the Edwards Trace. His father's farm butted up against it. So, but a lot of folks don't know Charlie Goodnight. They know Gus McCrae, and Lonesome Dove story, but they don't know the actual person that was based on. But so there's people like Charlie Goodnight that traveled the trace. Colonel William Russell. Colonel William Russell came from this glorious family. His father was a general that served with Washington during the Revolutionary War, served with Colonel Washington during the French Indian War. So this famous family also, they named Fort Russell Township after Colonel Russell, and he traveled the trail with Edwards. He was the Army liaison of that march.
Right.
And and a lot of folks don't know his story, and that's a shame, because he was one of our more famous frontiersmen of the time.
I was gonna say another story too with George Rogers Clark.
Yeah.
That's another. I feel like not too many people know about his story much
Right.
too. I mean, he.
Well, absolutely, and not just George Rogers, but he's fighting the British in the St. Louis area.
Right.
But the Spanish marched up that road to go attack Fort up on St. Joseph River, Fort St. Joseph. So they had to have used the trace, though we don't have that documentation.
Right.
But if they're going to go from East St. Louis, Cahokia area up to Chicago area, we know that they followed that route. But we know that the British followed that trail. We know the Spanish followed that trail, and then the early American, the French, of course, certainly. That was New France.
Right.
So they traded on that route. So there's a lot of, and there were world wars fought in Illinois, and the French and the British fought in Illinois over what was happening on the other side of the world. I mean, so that was no doubt a world war that the Native Americans got entwined with them.
Right. Seems like they're always in between, in the middle of things.
Right.
Gosh, but we talked earlier about the Kaskaskia Cahokia Trail, and they are considered like a nonprofit now.
Right.
And it's amazing. I was reading their the history of how they became this organization, and how they basically created this whole, I guess, like tourism trail in a way, with these like historical trail marks, and then they have maps for everyone, a whole website and everything. And they even have like a 5-year strategic plan for 2021 up to 2025.
Yeah.
Do you think the Edwards Trace will ever have that?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think Anna, when you start that, I think you're going to be very successful at it. I really do. I think you're going to find people, like-minded people, that's going to want to remember. It's worth remembering. And there's so many people along that 145 miles. It touched a lot of lives in a lot of different communities. Yeah. And certainly there is opportunity to remember that. I mean, to bring that to the forefront. And I think that's something that can be done, and I think it will be done eventually through efforts like what you've been doing. It's going to be remembered. And we started out as just a hobby, and then it ended up in a report in 2019 that was published by the Illinois Advancement of Archaeology, which we're so grateful for, because we didn't want our research just to blow away in the fog of time. And now the works that you're doing helps solidify all of that information, and it's out there for anybody. We didn't sell it, we gave it away. Anybody wants to look at it, just go to academia.edu, and it's there for download. So
and I think that's very important, because it's so nice to know that your information or your studies are accessible to everyone right now. And it's such a great, I've read it probably like 4 or 5 times.
Good. Well, there's a lot in there.
Oh, yeah. I have to always like go back and look at the maps.
Yeah.
I even used some of the maps in my presentation as examples, I remember.
Good.
But I mean, it's just such an interesting study. And like, I love that you guys are probably the first people to do that, really, for the trace.
Yeah, well, you know, we borrowed from everybody. I mean, it's kind of a pay it forward report.
Yeah.
What we learned from other people. Like I said, the Illinois State Museum was fantastic. Dr. Mike Wyant, he gave us so much supportive data about the trace, that the information about cultural sites, you know, in the Illinois State's database, they were fantastic. Bob Mazeram's publications, there was tons of stuff we learned about that. I think it was J. Mac Folliger that wrote a book, and I'm probably getting that name wrong, about Sugar Creek, a frontier living on Sugar Creek. That was published about 10 or 15 years ago. There was information about it there as well. So we picked up what we've seen and we tried to bring it all together. Our goal, though, was just not to talk about the trace, but to prove that it exists where it was supposed to be. So we wanted to put an X on the ground saying, here's the trace. You are now standing on the Edwards Trace. And we accomplished a lot of that, but it's just over time, it's just hard to get that information together. Sometimes folks don't want you on their property.
No.
You know, I've got a place to visit down by Gillespie, and I don't know who lives there. I just got to drive up and knock on their door. Can I go in your backyard? I think there's a wagon trail in your backyard.
I've done it too.
And so I imagine they're going to look at me like, who are you? Well, then I have to tell them all about the Edwards Trace. But I says, I think it's in your backyard by your children's swing. So, but sometimes we hit a home run on those cold calls like that, and other times folks don't want us anywhere near their properties. No, we're not interested in any old wagons going through their yard. So, but we've met a lot of great people that welcomed us on the property. They just wanted to learn, you know, about the trace as well, and who may went through there and when, and it's a heck of a great story. And the prehistoric story is the one I like to concentrate more on. What happened before the Euro-Americans arrived, before the French, before the British, the Native American story about it. The Illinois State Museum has a database, and when you look at it, it has a marking on Illinois' map for every cultural site, and there's some 58,000 cultural sites in Illinois that have been documented and investigated, and all the information gathered together, so we don't forget about our early history. And when you look at this map, the central part of the plains is kind of a blank spot. But where you do see cultural sites, there's places in the prairie where Native Americans shouldn't have been, but there is a common thread, and the trace went through that area. So we see this linear settlement pattern of Native American groups, and the trace could help explain why they were out in the prairie. Mississippian cultures out in the prairie around Glenarm, and we think it's because of that old road brought them to that area. So does that date the road to that time? I don't think so, not yet, but I think it's worthy of further study. So
well, I know we talked with Lincoln Memorial Park,
right,
but that portion that's been discovered, do you think there will really be, like, not a dig, but something out there? I think archaeological investigations today, the only really subsurface excavation done by archaeologists today is called recovery archaeology, just before a dozer puts in a new bridge. Then they said, well, it's about to be destroyed, so let's go in and see what's there and investigate this. And then that they will do because they know it's about to be lost. I mean, you think about development, it happens. Levees are built, gas lines are put in the ground, electrical current lines are put in the ground, water lines, you know, so sewers and roadways and rail beds. So this alters the surface of the ground forever. Once they move that, it's moved. So there is a law in Illinois that it has to have a survey done before major ground
manipulation takes place on a municipal project or a civil project, and then that's when they'll go in and look for what's under the ground. If there's not, one thing we found about down at Honey Point, let's just say, there's no cultural sites at all where we see all those ruts. Does that mean there was never, campsites or Native American villages? No, it just means no one's ever looked there. Mm-hmm. And I doubt if they ever will, because there's no need to. There's no highways going in there. There's no pipeline to cut through there. Now, the day that happens, I'm hoping that they will look at then before they go through and permanently manipulate soil, and that record is lost. The archaeologists will then go in, they'll have funding then to go in and look, so no, I don't think that they'll ever go to, unless the Memorial Park has a plan to put a big building in there, or
I hope they don't,
or a 4-lane road to go through, then they'll do that type of pre-archaeology, get in before the dozers get in there.
I'll probably have a protest out there.
One of the largest finds in Illinois archaeology in 100 years, one of the largest finds, was when they wanted to build the new Stan Musial Bridge in St. Louis. And it went through the old National Stockyard. It was going through that old urban decayed area of East St. Louis along the river. And part of that bridge was to fund an archaeological survey. And what they found, oh my gosh, they found a whole city lying underneath the cobblestone of that old 1850s stockyard. As soon as they pulled blocks up, they're finding artifacts. And they just looked, and in that narrow pathway that they had approval for, which was the 4 lanes of the interstate, they found mound remnants, they found cemeteries, they found, I think 100 houses, 100 pit homes of a culture that was never thought to be there. They knew Cahokia, but this is miles away, and they found this enormous village. So
what year was this?
Oh gosh, 20 years ago they started that, and it went on for about 5 or 6 years.
Yeah, I thought it's kind of like newer compared to Cahokia, the discovery, but I remember reading a little bit about that.
Mm-hmm. When you drive down Interstate 55 to St. Louis, you'll pass right through that large village, and off to the left, when there's a large curve in the road where Interstate 64 and 55 merge, on the left is a large mound site that's now forever gone because it was altered when East St. Louis, or Illinois town, I think they called it, built up in the mid-1800s. But there was an enormous Native American village. It's every bit as big as Cahokia, but you didn't have the large prominent mounds, and the mounds that they did have, or the group of mounds they did have, were flattened and used for fill and things over the years back in the 1800s. So one of the largest archaeological discoveries, though, in 100 years was when they decided to put a bridge in. So who knows what's out there? We hope that the state of Illinois will recognize the existence of the Edwards Trace. Right now, it's not a protected site. It's just, a chapter in a report we wrote, and Mazurms mentioned it, and others. But I'm hoping that the next time a pipeline goes through, that they'll say, we think the Edwards Trace is right here in this area. Could you do investigations to see what is there? And I think it's going to be a big surprise when they find out just how populated Illinois was throughout time. It just never
was like one of the most populated areas at the time.
Yes.
Really.
Yes.
When people were starting to move west.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. There was a pipeline going in from Missouri to Indiana and cutting through central Illinois and passing by Glenarm. And part of that was like a 15-foot wide path all the way across Illinois that they had to do shovel tests.
Yeah.
A group of archaeologists, and they would spend months turning over and screening shovel loads. And when they got to the Glenarm area, they discovered a Mississippian era household, a corner of a house, just caught the corner of it, and they did the study of it. It was completely shocked everyone. They had no idea that the Mississippians were living out in the middle of the prairie, but it was in a rock throw of the old trace. So was this farmstead, and it probably was several houses, a clan that lived there at that time, a farmstead, were there because of the Edwards Trace. Well, didn't follow up on that because the Edwards Trace hasn't really been identified. So we were hoping to identify where that trace would have been with scientific proof, that it's our physical proof.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, really it's an endangered trail.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's disappearing all the time. You know, every time plows go out, you know, more and more of that soil is intertwined. After 150 years of cultivation, much of it's gone forever. Where it crosses these creeks and valleys where we found the ruts, will they be there another 100 years? Not likely. It'll probably just be washed away eventually, or they'll timber those places and level it out to increase acreage, or put a subdivision in or something. So we see more and more of these subdivisions reaching far out. People are driving 40 miles to work every day now just to be further out in the city. And so these places that you would think that would be safe are disappearing, sure.
Well, do you think that this would ever be like an exhibit in the future, you think?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, sure.
Because I can easily see like the Illinois State Museum doing something.
Yeah.
For like that Edwards
Oh,
Trace.
absolutely.
Like it's so fascinating.
Yeah. Oh, everything I do, I send to them too.
Okay, I was gonna
Those
ask
guys
you.
get so tired of it. When I think I go right in their spam folder, and I send an email to one of the archives, and you know who you are, you see my emails, but I promote, there's a group here at U of I that I send everything we find. I send copies of our reports, because yes, I think that it's good stuff, and I think it should be remembered. It's, you know, we see sites. You know, we know we have a Native American village here, and we know we have a Native American village here, but not much about how they communicated between the two. We know they went from one to the other, but how? And so we feel that missing link should be remembered. And so yeah, the trace is very important in that. So yeah. And all these camp places, these campsites that the soldiers followed, you know, they've never been studied. No one's ever looked. Nope, no one's ever looked. We know exactly where they camped. We know the route that they took, but no one's ever really investigated from the archaeological, you know, scientific sub-search. So,
imagine what they could find.
yeah, well, sure, it's all still there. Yeah. Whatever they did, you know. Whenever a Native American family lived for a while, there's pottery in the ground, and there's, you know, old pieces of chipped stone. So all that is still there. That record is still there in the soil, but it's safekeeping for now. So yeah, we've never taken a shovel on our studies. We've always looked as the surface only, and where you reported it to the Illinois State Archaeological Survey and to the Illinois State Museum for their database. You know, of course, funding issues and things like that, you know, there is no funding, you know, for what do you want to do today? Well, it's not like that. They have a set thing that they can do, and we can hire this many people for this summer because we have this to do at this railroad crossing. Yeah. And that's about it. So
you say college student, not funded.
Yeah. So I hope that folks like you will pick up the baton and run with it. And it's all still there. It's not going anywhere, but there's so much to be discovered.
Well, it's people like you. I mean, there's very few of us that know about this. And I just think it's so important that we talk about it. And I think it's time that we talk about it.
Yeah, I once had an archaeologist, and I was chewing his ear off for about an hour about the Edwards Trace. He goes, you know, he says, has anybody ever told you you're absolutely fascinated with the obscure? And I said, absolutely. I hear it all the time. Like, who cares about this rut? I do. And
I
in the
like it.
future, you'll thank me. Someday you'll need this information. Not right away, but someday somebody will need this.
Well, that's why we're doing this
Yeah.
today.
Yeah. But in 50 years, who knows? I mean, remote sensing they're doing so much without touching the soil. There's so much technology just becoming available. It's still beyond my grasp. I would love to have the technology that's available today. But in 50 years from now, you could just go out and wave some sort of a metal detector type thing that'll photograph 15 feet down in the
Right.
soil. So that's coming, and
Yeah.
and then we'll learn a lot.
Yeah, it's gonna be crazy just to think like what's gonna happen in 50 years with
Mhm.
that advancement in
Mhm.
technology. I mean, I know with my career, technology changes all the time.
Hmm.
So it's
Oh,
just
yeah.
crazy to think about. So
Yes.
I mean, I hopefully I can get a hold of that
Yeah.
and do it on my own.
Yeah. Well, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Along the trace, see what I
Yeah.
can find.
Sure. Well, I mean, it's all waiting to be discovered, and we found 11 years. We pieced together 3 miles.
3
You would
miles.
think, boy, you guys are slackers, but it's not. It's a daunting challenge to find the documentation, to find these old maps, to get the time to drive up from Kentucky to do field
Yeah.
surveys, and we've done it so many times I can't count. But it's a work in progress.
It takes time,
Mhm.
yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, and historians though, we want that documentation, and that's important for us to
Mhm.
find, to see if this is true.
Yeah.
Because it's like a puzzle, like you're trying to figure out like
Yes.
where this piece goes.
Yes, but I have been blessed with a lot of great support from a lot of great
great.
people. The U of I has been very supportive. The Illinois State Museum, just a good group of folks. Your website is spreading the word, so it's going to be out there for a while for anybody that wants to pick it up and look at it.
Yeah.
Everything that I've ever done, I pay it forward for free. I just publish it and get it out there. So I think it's great that anyone such as yourself is interested in this dusty old trail, but I think it's great, and I'm hoping that other people become interested and want to continue that rolling ball down the hill. So keep pushing it. So
Thank you, yeah.
Mhm.
I'm excited. But look, seriously, thank you for coming
Oh, you're
today.
welcome.
Like, I
you're welcome. Glad
appreciate
to have
it.
come up. So it's just been great fun. I'm glad to help any way I can, and hopefully somebody out there in viewer land will say, let's look into this in our area. So
Yeah.
because there's big gaps in our map. I mean, big gaps. So
Well, is there anything you would like to tell anyone? Any last comments?
oh, just that there's tons of history. What's in books is just the skim, just the very top of Illinois' history, and you'll find that out. That once you start looking into the old records that the National Archive would love to share with you, once you get out in the field and start looking around, you're going to have tons of questions, and you're going to realize that folks haven't taken the time to answer them, and go out and get after it. So, and pay it forward.
Well, if anyone would want to get in contact with you or anything, like,
Absolutely. Well, my email address is shallowboat@comcast.net. Feel free to email anytime. I'll answer any all questions. I'll forward old maps that I have, but I'll be happy to share anything that we have. And our report that we wrote up was published by Rediscovery Magazine in 2019. Copies are still available through the Illinois Advancement of Archaeology here in Champaign. And also you can download a copy on academia.edu. Just type in Edwards Trace, documenting the Edwards Trace, and that'll take you to our report, and it's available for download. And also ground truthing we did down at Sangamon River. We did a soil surface survey and with Dr. Mike Wyant, and that's also available for anybody, with some great maps included in that. So
okay.
yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Thank you.